Welcome, everybody. Hello, my name is Maggie Guggenheimer, and I'm the Administrative Director of the Division of Perceptual Studies, also known as DOPS, which was founded in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. We're so glad that you've joined us this evening for a webinar in which we'll share new findings from our decades-long body of research on children with past life memories. For those who don't know, DOPS is the most productive and longest-running university-based research group in the world devoted to the rigorous evaluation of empirical evidence for extraordinary human experiences and capacities. Our work extends beyond scientific investigation to include exploration of the ongoing impact of this research on people today, as well as its implications for scientific theory. You can learn more about DOPS's mission and our efforts on our website, which we'll put a link to in the chat. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from our newest faculty member, Dr. Philip Cozzolino, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences in the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Previously at University of Essex in the UK, Dr. Cozzolino has spent the last 20 years employing lessons from near-death experience research to develop a psychological model of mortality awareness and acceptance. His work has been covered in the Huffington Post, Psychology Today, Scientific American, and BBC Radio 4, and has generated research from numerous psychologists around the world. Dr. Cozzolino joined DOPS in January, just this year, to work closely with our director, Dr. Jim Tucker, on what we call COURT research. COURT is the acronym for Dr. Stevenson's term, cases of the reincarnation type. And he brings a view toward understanding the mechanisms of past life memories to his work here. We're delighted to have him on the team at DOPS and with us here tonight to share new findings about the role of parental attitudes in these cases and other trends we're uncovering from the extensive COURT database. During the webinar, you can use the Q&A function on your screen to submit questions for Dr. Cozzolino, who will speak for about 40 minutes and then take as many questions as we have time for before we wrap up at 9 p.m. Eastern. I just want to thank you again for being with us tonight, or whatever time it is where you're tuning in from. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Philip Cozzolino.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Maggie, for the introduction. It's so nice to see so many people here joining the webinar. My name is Philip, as Maggie said. We're going to be talking about a paper that's under review right now at a peer-reviewed journal. Myself and a couple of co-authors, Jim Tucker, Marietta Elivanova, and we're going to talk specifically about the findings of this paper, looking at what we know about parental attitudes in these COURT cases, these cases of the reincarnation type. Just a quick note about the talk. I've basically stripped all of the statistics out of the slides. I wanted to focus more today on sort of the question, the answers, the story, but just know that the stats are there and they've been done appropriately. And once the paper is published, which we're confident it will be, we'll have it up on the DOPS website for you to see. So let's talk a bit about COURT, cases of the reincarnation type. I'm not going to spend too much time on the history, but it is important for you to understand where we come from. And as Maggie said, Dr. Ian Stevenson, who founded what is now the Division of Perceptual Studies, was the chair of the psychiatry department at UVA, had an interest in parapsychology and had the opportunity and funding to send him overseas to pursue some cases that came across his desk of these sorts of cases where it seemed that young children were expressing what appeared to be memories that could be linked to a past life. And he went and did that in multiple countries around the world. And in 1960, he published his first paper on the topic, which was 44 cases. 18 were in India, a few were in America. They were scattered around. And in that process of sort of investigating these original 44 cases, Dr. Stevenson worked out what has become the protocol for how to approach these cases. It's a forensic detailed, investigative, iterative process where multiple times he would speak to the families, to the children, to relatives, to neighbors. Once the child had expressed enough information that he could find who might actually have been, or at least who the child claimed was the previous personality, that's the term that he developed and that we use to represent the life that ended before the new child's life, the previous personality. He would then go and interview family members and relatives and neighbors and coworkers, as many as he could find, corroborating evidence, trying to find even opposing evidence. I have gone through pages and pages of his handwritten and typewritten notes where after interview 2 with a family, he would list, here are all the questions I'm still uncertain about. I need to drill down on this particular claim, and we need to find someone who can see if this is accurate or not. So that was the basic protocol, generating a large database of cases with multiple variables for each of these cases. And we've come since 1960 to today, where at DOPS, we have a database of more than 2,200 documented forensically investigated cases of these reincarnation type children. Every continent that anyone has ever checked to see if a case exists like this, they have found one, except Antarctica. Doesn't matter whether those continents or countries or cultures have beliefs in reincarnation or not. If you ask and you look, they exist. We have, this is literally a photo of my desk or just below my desk, the files from every one of these investigations. These are 40 that I'm working on for another paper that I won't be talking about today, but these are all Ian Stevenson's notes, handwritten notes, transcripts of long conversations, autopsy reports from the previous personality, verifying that the child said they died in this particular manner, and then evidence from the previous personality to back that up or not. Ian Stevenson did his work. It transformed eventually some Emily Kelly, Antonia Mills, my colleague at DOPS, Dr. Jim Tucker, who focused mostly on American cases. So for decades, multiple investigators with the help of other researchers, interpreters, have done this work and toiled away at it rigorously, trying to generate the evidence that we have today. So what do we know? That's the basic history of it. But 60 years of these investigations, what do we know? What is a typical feature of a court case, a case of the reincarnation type? Well, it's young children. The median age of when children start talking about these apparent memories, what they claim are memories of a previous life, is 32 months. So basically 2.5 to 3 years old, these children start having and expressing these memories to their families. And these are spontaneous statements. They're not like some of you may be familiar with hypnotic regression, where mostly adults, but certainly older than 2 to 3 year olds may be placed under some sort of hypnosis where they can sort of come out of that experience saying, I'm aware that I had this past or previous life. That's a very common thing that has occurred in the context of reincarnation. We don't, that's not what this is, and that's not really the way that we approach this. These are 2 to 3 year olds on average who suddenly start speaking about a life that appears to have been one they lived before their current one. And I'll give a little bit more detail about some of the common statements that come out from these 2 to 3 year olds. They describe a life that ended about 1.5 years before their current life. That's the median. There are some where it's 0. So the previous personality, the life that existed before, according to them, died while the mother was pregnant with the child who's now expressing the memories. There are some that are much longer than 1.5 years, but that's the median. About 1.5 years from the time that the previous personality dies to when the child is born, a couple years later, then expressing these memories. The thing that's important to note, because sometimes with reincarnation claims, it's I was the King of England or I was Genghis Khan. That's not what these 2 to 3 year olds claim. The expressions that that come out are I was a cab driver, or I pulled a cart and sold fruit. It is just ordinary lives, oftentimes very close geographically to where they currently live. Although again, like with the median interval of 18 months, geographically close is just the most common. There are cases, we just had a case come over the transom recently of a Southern California family with evidence they think is their child living from South Africa, a previous life. So there are global distances, but on average, ordinary lives geographically close to where the child is. And here's a point that's going to come up a few times tonight, and I think you'll see the reason why I did this study. 65% of these cases, of these 2,200 plus cases, these children speak about how they died, and 65% of that is an unnatural, often violent death. So again, a 2 to 3-year-old talking about dying in a fire, dying in a plane crash, being stabbed, being murdered. And it's a huge percentage that we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk, this notion about these children having that kind of memory, apparent memory. It's important to note also that this only lasts for a few years. On average, we find, and historically this has been true through the whole 60 plus years, that about 6 or 7 years of age, the memories fade. Children, I mean, biologically, the brain is changing, their world is expanding, they are adventuring out. They're venturing out well beyond the bubble of their home and their family. They have friends, they have programmed lives. They're learning more at school. And eventually you find that the memories just fade and they don't really continue the conversation about who they think they used to be. So this is the classic sort of picture of what a court child looks like. If you want more detail, and if you actually want to see some of this in practice, I recommend, if you have Netflix or a friend with a password, go to Netflix and watch the documentary Surviving Death. Episode 6 of 6 is specifically about the court cases. You'll see my colleague, Jim Tucker. He walks you through a couple cases and you learn about some of the famous cases that he's studied. I also recommend watching episode 1 of this, which is specific about my other colleague, Dr. Bruce Grayson, and the decades of work he's done on near-death experiences. So people who have died clinically declared dead and yet somehow seem to have stories of their experience that suggest anyway that consciousness has continued after they had died. So episode 1 and episode 6 of Surviving Death will give you a much better sense, certainly 6 in terms of the court cases. I want to hammer down a little bit on this 2 to 3-year-old children. You have to remember, 2 to 3-year-olds. I don't have children, but I've met a couple 2 to 3-year-olds. They're still figuring themselves out. They're figuring out the world. So this is a lot for them to be handling and processing, not just being a 2 to 3-year-old, but actually then also having memories about living and dying a previous life. We find that the range of emotion is quite wide. Sometimes there's just detachment. Often we've had parents talk about, it's so funny, we'll be at the park and they'll be looking and they'll look, Mommy, look at the balloons. And then a second later, oh, you know, when I died in that fire, and then they'll go, oh, look, a squirrel. It's just so nonchalant, matter of fact. Other times, intense distress, heavy experiences of emotion. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Oftentimes, night terrors, traumatic play, which seems to be reliving those horrible moments of their death, all the way to extreme anger, especially in those cases where the previous personality that they're seeming to remember died in some terrible sort of intentional murder consequence. They will be very angry about that experience and in other ways as well. Also, the language. You have to remember that they're not talking, they're not expressing monologues about their experience. They're just 2 to 3-year-olds. To be clear, Dr. Tucker has a paper that he's published a few years back that shows that court kids, compared to kids of their age in similar situations, are significantly more intelligent and more verbal. They have significantly better verbal skills than a typical 2 to 3-year-old would have. But still, they're 2 to 3 years old. So what might come out, this actually was one from a case in our files where the child, I believe, was recalling memories that he or she believed was like a great-grandmother to his mother. And it was when I was your age, the child would say to its mother, I used to change your diapers. This is pretty common. This is just a standard catch-all. We see this all the time. The child will say, you're not my real mommy. You're not my first daddy. Oftentimes with power in their voice. They're declarative. When I used to live here when I used to live in this country, this town, sometimes even in this age, in this era. And again, we come back to this point that is important for tonight. 75% talk about how they died. It's, again, for a 2 to 3 year old, especially given that 65% of our cases involve unnatural violent deaths, this is a key component that shows up all the time. And it's what has sort of led to this tonight, right? Because you can see all of this, no wonder the focus has been on the children. I mean, from Ian's point of view and from everyone else who's been studying this, they're the source of this phenomenon. They are the ones expressing these memories and having these often emotional experiences. And once we have identified a previous personality, so once enough information has come from the child that can be linked to, okay, well, they said they came from this village and died in this very specific way, and that they had this particular job and worked in this particular company. Well, if enough people investigate those claims, oftentimes we find this previous personality. So we'll start spending an awful lot of time there, find their relatives, find their coworkers. And that's all great. But my question when I arrived was, what about the parents? This just must be incredibly challenging for them, even in cultures with reincarnation beliefs, right? Even in a culture where it's embedded in the religion, the cosmology, just the cultural foundation that reincarnation is real and happens. It must be incredibly uncomfortable as a parent, even in that situation, to have your child say, "You're not my mommy, you're not my daddy. I died in a plane crash, a fiery plane crash." One of Jim Tucker's most famous cases that you'll see in episode 6 of that documentary is James Leininger, who told a story about a past personality that his memories seemed to link to a pilot who died in a fiery plane crash over Iwo Jima in World War II. And these parents didn't just have to hear, "I died in a plane crash." They would see uh, James having night terrors and nightmares and post-traumatic play, where he would crash toy planes into his coffee table over and over again. So much so that Jim has a photo of that coffee table where you just see hundreds and hundreds of dents in the wood from all of the toy planes that crashed, that James Leininger would crash into the table. Again, imagine being a parent and seeing this from your 2 to 3, 4-year-old. "Take me back home. This isn't my home. I don't want to be here anymore," right? So this is, I think, really interestingly corroborated. And just, if you haven't seen this yet, you'll find a link in the chat, I believe. Just last week, May 2nd, the Washington Post published this article all about the work, court work, Jim Tucker's work. And as you can see here, the subtitle is "What Happens When Your Toddler is Haunted by Memories That Aren't Hers." And the photo here I've added because this story details one particular case among a few where the child was telling a story and their memories that appears to be suggestive of, again, a 2 to 3-year-old child talking about having been someone who died in the Holocaust, talking about the number that was tattooed on their arm and other graphic details, which I'll read in a second here. So again, imagine being a parent. This comes from this article. It wasn't just the words of the child that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Marie's, the mom's, body. Quote from the mother: "There was such a deep pain there. It seemed beyond what a toddler should know." Soon after the child told her mother about the numbers on Nina's forearm, Nina being the previous personality, Aisha, the child, also began to wake at night in a state of agitation, crying and pacing in her room. She would say she was afraid of eyes staring at her in the dark, or bad guys who would take her away, or bluish clouds that were coming to kill us all. And as the mother says in this article, it's confounding, astounding, it's fantastical. How could this child know anything about the Holocaust? She has had no experience, exposure to it, let alone understanding that there were tattooed numbers, that there was gas that was used to kill people. And yet from this child, these expressions were coming out from what appeared to be this past life that the child lived. So I think that's what led to this work and what generated this paper. Now, before I start presenting some results, it's important that I talk about one key variable that's going to show up a little bit here. And it's something that Jim published and, in a sense, generated out of our database a few years back, called the strength of case measure. And the strength of case is generated from four important features of a court case. And the way we think about it is the stronger the case, the stronger the score, the higher the score is. And the higher the strength of case score is, the harder it becomes to say that what's happening here is just pure chance alone or fraud or any other way that you might explain it. So another way of saying that is the stronger the case, the more likely it is that the best explanation for it is an anomalous one. That's the language that we use. And obviously, the weaker the case, the more likely it might be chance, coincidence, fraud, any other thing. So the four features that make up the strength of case score and the scale is birthmarks and defects. Now, if you've never heard this before, this is something that shows up in a large percentage of the cases and has since the very beginning when Ian Stevenson started this work. And that is that a number of court kids who are having these apparent memories actually describe a fatal wound in the previous personality that corresponds to a birthmark or defect on their body. So this is a real photo that Ian Stevenson took of a court child from Thailand. And you can see there, this child remembered living the life of a man who was a cattle thief and who was caught by angry villagers and killed by those villagers. And they struck that person, the previous personality, killing him at the back of the head with a heavy knife. And then that was verified. That was corroborated in the investigation. And here is the child who's having these memories, born with this mark on the back of his head corresponding to the fatal wound of the cattle thief. We've seen there are other photos and other cases where they've had limbs chopped off in the process of being murdered, and the child who is then having the past life memories of that previous personality was born without an arm, the arm that was cut off, and that was corroborated on the previous personality end. So the point being, as remarkable as that may sound, you can understand why, to the extent that we have verified those fatal wounds in the previous personality that seem to correspond to those in the current children, that scores you more points on the strength of case scale. Previous life statements is the second of the four features, and this is just the statements. I used to live in this country. I had this job. I was married to a woman named Marie. I worked as a butcher, right? Eventually, once all of these statements can be corroborated, some will be verified, some won't, some will be wrong. But to the extent that the more of them that the child makes that are eventually verified, the child, the case, earns more points, and the case gets stronger. Because obviously, now there are some cases where they may only say three things, and those three things are remarkable. So you're not necessarily tied to that. But in the context of a large, almost 2,300 person database, it's a decent estimate of, is this a case that has legitimacy to it? How many statements did they make? How many were verified? You get more points for each one that is. The behaviors, the more that are verified and the more that we can document, the more points you get. And what do we mean by that? Well, there are certain people, previous personalities that had certain skills, certain cravings, certain phobias as well. Do they transfer, and do we see those in the current child? The phobias are often related to the deaths, right? So there'll be a case where a child will be telling a story of how they died by drowning, and the parents will say, the child always threw a fit when we wanted to give it a bath. Even before it could speak, it would freak out when it came around water. When the child became verbal, they would explicitly say, I don't like water, water's bad, water dangerous, those kinds of things. The more they link to not only to the way the previous personality died, but also if they had special skills, special cravings, and if they exist in the child today, again, the score goes up some more. And then the fourth and final factor that makes up the strength of case scale is the connection to the deceased person. And in this case, it works sort of backward. It's not being close to, it's being distant from, both geographically and also in terms of relationships. So in other words, you don't want to take someone who just says, well, it's my family. I believe I've come back as my grandmother or great grandmother, as necessarily just take it on face value that's true, because, well, there are stories passed around from families, right? And the child may have picked up things, they may have been told a certain phobias, skills, cravings about that particular relative. So if a child, if you're able to document birthmarks and verified statements and behaviors, and the previous personality lived far away, and this child and his family or her family had no relationship or no connection to that family, that means, okay, perhaps there's something more legitimate here, because how else would they have known all of this information? They had no connection, both geographically or in relationship terms, to that previous personality. So you combine all of these algorithmically, you get a score. Higher means more indicative of an anomalous experience, more suggestive of it anyway. I hope that makes sense. So here's the title of the paper: Parental Encouragement Suppression and Suppression of a Child's Past Life Memories. We're going to get into some of what this paper actually looks like. I focused on two questions that we ask of the parents. Well, we don't really ask them. They don't fill it out themselves. They're assessed by the investigators in the questioning, in the investigation. And these are attitudes of the parents, the mother and the father, about how encouraging are you of your child's expression of these memories. Are you very encouraging? Are you neutral? Are you very discouraging? All the way to the point of being suppressing. Are you actively suppressing your child's memories? So here's how that looks. It's a 1 to 9 continuous measure. 1 means greatly encouraged. The middle point is neutral or tolerant. 8 and 9 of the 1 to 9 scale represent actively suppressing the child's memories. And that could be non-violently, so yelling, but it also could be violently, like spanking, corporal punishment. And we have those cases as well. You know, stop saying these things, spanking the child perhaps to do so. And we assess those questions from the mother and father at 2 different points: initial attitudes. So the case is relatively new. The child's been talking about it. How do you feel about this? And then we ask the mother and father, or we assess the mother and father's attitudes again subsequently, later, as the investigation has gone on, as more data have come in. And specifically, the subsequent attitude question is after the parents have met with the previous personality's family. So these are cases that have gotten so far down the road that there's been a previous personality identified, and that the family of the current child is actually been connected to some element, some family, some relative of that past personality, the previous personality. So we have the initial attitudes, subsequent attitudes of both mother and father. And what I looked at were the cases of our 2,200 cases. I found out how many of those cases do we have answers to the subsequent attitudes of parents from both mother and father. So what that means is I really wanted to see, after the case had developed, after these parents had met with the previous personality relatives, we had a valid measure of their attitudes from both parents. Nothing wrong with single parents, nothing, all that's important, but that was just the first approach here. Is I wanted to look at the dynamics of mother and father, where after they had gone through this whole process and met with the previous personality relatives, where were they on this measure? That brought us 529 cases where we had a valid subsequent attitude score from both mother and father. Those cases ranged from 1962 to 2015. So multiple countries, multiple eras. It's an archival deep dive into our database looking at these parental attitudes. And again, remember that subsequent attitude means it isn't just later. It's gotten so far that they have already met with the previous personality's family. So what did we find? I'm going to start presenting some results here. Again, no stats, just telling you the story, but all of these are like paired sample t-tests, and all of these are significant if you know traditional ways of statistical testing. What we found is that the initial attitudes were different between mothers and fathers, right? So early on, before the case had developed to the point where they had met with the previous personality families, what we found is that mothers were significantly more encouraging of their child's memories than fathers. Be clear, that doesn't mean that they were just thrilled. They were on average right in the midpoint, around 4.4 on that 9-point scale. But they were more encouraging fathers. Fathers were a bit still unsure about what was happening in the beginning stages. That changed the second time after the case developed. When we look at the subsequent attitudes, the mothers stayed the same, but the fathers became more encouraging so that they looked a little bit more like where the mothers were to start. So it took fathers a little bit longer, more data had to come in. It is my interpretation for the fathers to eventually start becoming more encouraging when you look at it that way, right? Which is an interesting effect, not the biggest one of the findings, but it's there. I wanted to look specifically at the suppression, those families that we classified as the 8s and 9s out of that 1 to 9. So very much encouraging all the way to suppressing, actively suppressing, either physically or not physically. And when you look at that, we find 111 of the 529, so 21% of the families actively suppressed the child's memories. Anything they could do, either yelling and or physically, corporal punishment, stop expressing these memories. So a decent percentage of them were actively suppressing this. And we have in the database answers to, well, why? Why were they suppressing these memories from their child? And this is the way it breaks down. These are all percentages of those 111, right? So this is 111 families. Parents are suppressing their child. Why? 21.5% of them said that they were worried that the previous personality family were going to come and take the child away from them. Oftentimes the child is saying, I want to go live with the previous, but that's my real family. And they've met with the family. So you can imagine a large percentage of these people who are suppressing because they're scared of losing their child in that manner. 20%, the next column over, were scared that this whole process was just hurting their child. Could be the night terrors, could be the reliving the trauma. They were scared for their child's safety in general. Almost another 20, so 18%, said they were scared that somehow or another, for whatever reason, they thought this process was going to lead to their child dying young, earlier than perhaps the child should. You can then see everything kind of drops a little bit after that. About 8% roughly said they were suppressing their child's memories because they didn't want publicity. They were worried about the stigma, embarrassed about it. 6% said, well, the kid's talking nonsense, so that's why I'm suppressing it. This isn't real. 4% roughly said we're suppressing because we don't want to be seen as exploiters of our child. And then 22.5%, we couldn't really classify. It wasn't obvious as to why, but it's certainly not obvious enough to put into one of these other buckets. But I think it's pretty clear anyway, I hope it is, if you look at these 6 really out of the 7, that you can classify these first 3 as one basic reason, which is the parents were scared for the safety of their child, whether they would lose them, whether they would be harmed, whether they would die too young. They were suppressing this group, these 3 bars of parents, because they were scared for the safety of their child. Different for the reasons the rest of that 111 were suppressing. And now if we look at those, if we combine those people, those parents who suppressed for one of these 3 reasons, the safety of the child reasons, we find some interesting results. If we use that as a predictor of the strength of case scale, what we find is the parents who were suppressing their child, actively suppressing the child's memories for those particular reasons, because they were scared for the safety of their child, those were significantly stronger cases than the cases of the other suppressing families, suppressing because it was embarrassing, suppressing because I don't want the publicity, et cetera. Right? So remember, strength of case means the stronger it is, the more likely, more suggestive it is of an anomalous experience. Parents who were suppressing because they were scared for the safety of their child, those were strong cases, significantly stronger than the rest of the suppressors. If you combine all of the suppressors for any reason, all of those 7 reasons, right? 111 families actively said to their child, stop saying this, and compare them to everyone else who didn't actively suppress, what you find is the same effect. Suppression predicts significantly stronger cases in our database. And what's interesting about that is that it's a common skeptical reaction to some of this to say, well, it's one of the fears that some of the parents express. Well, these parents are just ginning up this case because they want publicity, they want to write a book, or they want to promote their religious beliefs, their cultural beliefs of reincarnation. Our database of 60 plus years suggests that's not true, because The suppressors, the parents who are actively saying and even physically harming their child to stop them, those are cases that would be the most supportive of a reincarnation claim. So the stronger the case becomes, the more likely it seems that parents are going to start wanting to suppress it. Not every one of them, but that's where the effect is. Suppression predicts strength of case. Interesting. When we look at the parents' education levels, we don't have a ton of demographic information on the parents, but we do have some. And education levels, interesting. Mothers who suppressed, actively suppressed, right? That 8 or 9 category. They were significantly less educated than mothers who didn't suppress. So mothers they didn't necessarily encourage it, but they hadn't gotten to that point of actively suppressing their child. They were significantly more educated than the mothers who were actively suppressing it. There was no educational difference among fathers, whether they suppressed or not. So for some reason, that only mattered in the context of mothers. There's a little bit of that you'll see at the end of the slide, why that might be, or how that might play out is a better way of saying that. And then I'm going to finish with the big finding that sort of ends the paper, which is that what we found was, I'm going to sort of tell the story up front, which is we found when we compared mothers and fathers' attitudes together at the same time in a statistical process known as multiple regression, what that allows us to do is it allows us to look at the relationship between the mother's attitudes and strength of case and the father's attitude and strength of case all at the same time. Okay, that's the easy way of thinking about it, and see how all of the relationships in a correlational approach, how those relationships, what they look like. So we put the full attitude for mother, the full attitude for father, and we had them try to see how they related to the strength of case measure. And here's what we found. We found differential relationships. In other words, they were different from each other with the strength of case. So as the strength of case increased, the more suggestive the case became of an anomalous experience, the more the attitudes of fathers became more encouraging, controlling for the mother's attitudes. Conversely, as the strength of case increased, the attitudes of mothers became less encouraging, controlling for the father's attitudes. So you see what's happening here is when you look at it from this perspective, combining mothers and fathers and allowing them to sort of speak to each other statistically and control for each other, what's left is that the case gets stronger, more suggestive of an anomalous experience. The fathers become more encouraging and the mothers start becoming less encouraging, which is, I think, potentially explained by, and we in the paper talk about this cautiously. And the reason we say that is because this is old. These are, 1962 to 2015, multiple countries, multiple cultures and eras. We can't come and say we know exactly what's happening here. What we can tell you is what the relationships are and what these, how this plays out over these years that we've explored this. But there is a well-known, well-studied theory in psychology known as attachment theory. Some of you may know this. It's a theory about how children seek comfort from their parents. And generally, the work shows historically, it's changed a bit in the modern era, but generally children seek different outcomes from the mothers that they might seek from their fathers. Broadly, generally speaking, mothers provide comfort, emotional comfort in times of distress. When the child is experiencing great distress, I want my mommy. Fathers generally play a role that's affiliative, more like a playmate. The child may be wanting to do something that it doesn't have a lot of experience. Maybe I want to work with some tools, or I want to climb a tree, or I want to ride a bike, whatever it might be. And the daughter might go, "Daddy, can you help me do this?" Right? So that's a broad swath kind of look at the attachment notion that parents provide different comfort and sort of functions for their children. When it's distress and emotions, it's generally mothers. When it's novelty and new skills are required, can you help me solve this problem? It's more oftentimes the father, especially in this traditional way historically of studying parents and their children. And what we're thinking is at least with this historic data, perhaps for mothers with a court child who is, many of them are having distressful experiences and heavy emotional experiences, that kicks in, that relationship, the attachment relationship kicks in for mothers, and they want to protect them from harm, and they pull away from encouraging, and they start moving more towards the suppressing side because it's them protecting their child, whereas the fathers start moving more towards encouragement because they see this as a problem that needs to be solved. And it's also a bit more of an analytic approach to the problem, saying, well, okay, let's see, the data are coming in and that's compelling. And it does seem that the claims that the child made matches this other thing. So how do we work around this? How do we get through this situation? And that reveals itself as being more encouraging of the memories. And that's a very broad sort of cautious inference as to what might be partly at work here with these very interesting children and their experiences. Now, just to kind of make this point clear, I asked my colleague Elliot Gish, who's a research specialist at Dobbs. I said, I found a case in our data that I've presented here. I isolated a strong case, again, suggestive of anomalous explanation, with a suppressing mother and a non-suppressing father. So I found that perfect sort of case that matches the general effect that we found, right? Strong case, mother is suppressing, father is not. And I said, go pull the file on this case. And here's what we found in that case. Ian Stevenson's notes, you can see here right off of the page from India in 1974. Ian wrote, village women told Sarvesh's mother to do some spell on him so he will forget about his previous life. Subject's mother did not want to lose her son, so on Sunday and Tuesday, in India, there are certain days for certain spells, Ian wrote, she put her hand on subject's head. According to the lady, the boy stopped talking about his previous life after the spell she put on him. Now, the reason I bolded she put her hand on subject's head is because later in these files, Ian interviewed a neighbor who said they were there for the spell, and it wasn't putting the hand on the subject's head, it was the mother slapping the boy's head repeatedly doing the spell, which again links to that suppression, active, physically, violently suppressing. And then in the same folder, here's Ian's notes from this exact same case. According to the subject's father, his son is a very good student who always stands second in his class. The boy started to study at the age of 5. The father also said that he observed his boy very closely and found out that he prefers to work in a shop rather than working in the fields. So it just struck me again. It's color, it's context. But it is interesting how it links not only to the effects we found, but to the attachment theory, a sort of potential explanation for some of what we found, which is a mother who is scared of losing her child and is relying on anything, folk wisdom, demon, get out of my child protection. Whereas the father, that analytic approach of he's a good boy. He does well in school. I think, he says this, we found evidence for that. So that's my view of this situation, right? Again, paraphrasing, sort of putting a little bit more into what's here, but I think it jumps off the page when you see the different reaction that the father and the mother had to this very strong case and the way they were speaking about it. So that's that paper that's under review. And I just wanted to leave you with 2 slides about a new paper that will be under review soon. Myself, my colleagues, Jim Tucker and Marietta Pelavanova. Marietta is the lead author on this paper, and it's the follow-up. That's what we call it, the follow-up study. And this is the first follow-up study of American court cases. There have been some other follow-ups on cases of around the world elsewhere. But what we did here, Jim has spent his career focusing on American cases, and there are some Ian cases as well that are included here, but they were specifically only in America. And what we did is we went to them and we said, here you are now, many years later, you're an adult. What do you recall from the memories that you first had as a child? How did they impact you as you developed through life? We measured their personality and classic psychological measures. We measured well-being on classic measures that you would use for that. We ended up with, in this study, 23 adults, meaning once were court kids with these memories, and 29 parents. Now, there's only 12 overlap, right? Like, so 12 of these were mother and child, excuse me. It's just difficult to find people. This is 17 to 45 years was the range of how long ago they had been interviewed by a DOPS sort of court researcher. So some of this was a challenge to find these people, but still we have these 23 court kids, I'm going to focus on them tonight more than the parents, even though I've spent a lot of time talking about parents. We asked them specifically, do you remember any of your past life memories? They remembered, everyone remembered sort of being interviewed and having, I think, being a court kid, if you will, but 52% of them really had no memories of the past life. Those, I died in a plane crash or whatever, none of that. 52% of them, they had faded entirely. The 48% that had some memories still of the past life, you'll see, no surprise, the most common dealt with how they had died in that previous person, as that previous person. So that mode of death, oftentimes violent and unnatural, that's always sort of, that leads the way for so many of these cases. Important to note, and what we really take away from this study, is that the court adults had normal levels of all kinds of measures. Absorption is a psychological construct about getting lost in imagination, getting focused deeply in something. They were normal, no different than what you'd expect from adults their age. All the classic big five personality traits were within exactly what you'd expect from adults of their age. They were slightly higher on measures of spiritual well-being, which was interesting. And a few of them made comments about how they thought they were better. They thought they were a healthier relationship with the idea of death because of all of this, which is good to see. Slightly higher on a measure known as fantasy proneness, so thinking about things that being creative in your thought and fantastical thinking, but nowhere near, not significantly more so, but just slightly more than what you'd expect. And again, slightly higher on a measure of dissociation, which at the high end is a clinical assessment that leads all the way to multiple personality disorder, but at the lowest end can mean just like a daydreamer, someone who often can get lost in thought in that way and sort of get distracted. But slightly higher than what you'd expect on average, but nowhere near what would be classified as a pathological assessment of dissociation. So all things being equal, what this paper says is here are 23 kids who once were studied by court researchers for past life memories, and they are normal, happy adults. And that's a good takeaway. I'm going to leave you with two slides because I think it's important to have this end this talk today, which is the people at court, like myself, we love what we do, and we're excited to do it. And we understand that it's provocative and not mainstream. But it's also important for us to always be reminding ourselves and others that our approach at DOPS is based off of the legacy of Dr. Ian Stevenson, and that is to be rigorous and to be scientific and to take our training very seriously in the way that we approach this work. And there are two elements from his past that I want to share with you tonight that I think we think about a bit in our DOPS often. This is the standard bearer of medical journals. You've probably heard the Journal of the American Medical Association. In 1975, they wrote about his work doing this work in particular. In regard to reincarnation, he, Ian Stevenson, has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. He has placed on record a large amount of data that cannot be ignored. And then from Ian's own words, the very last paper he published professionally as a scientist was titled Half a Career with the Paranormal. And the very last lines of that paper that he wrote were, "Let no one think that I know the answer. I am still seeking." And I just think, yeah, we at DOPS, we are still seeking. So that's my talk.
Thank you so much, Philip. What a great overview of the court research and the latest from the team engaging in it. Really appreciate your time, and again, appreciate everybody being with us. We do have some questions in the Q&A function, and for those who maybe haven't seen the chat, we are taking questions via a function of Zoom. You have to submit it using your keypad, and you may have to find that in the More section of the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And without much more time on that, I'm going to jump right into the questions so we can answer as many as possible. So the first question that came in, Philip, when you say 65% die abnormally or even violently, what do you mean by abnormal? Does that include people who have cancer or heart disease who don't make it to a particular age, for example?
I think the word we use is unnatural. And that to me is not cancer, not heart attack, right? It's drowning, snake bite. I've been looking at a bunch of these cases lately, stabbing, shooting. That's what we mean when we say that, right? There are definitely cases, like I said, 65 are that. But there are plenty of cases where people just will, you look through the files, you know, I lived a long life. I died of old age. I had a heart attack at 70. I mean, right, that's a natural death. That's not necessarily what we would classify as an unnatural death.
Great. Thank you. Um, and next question here, which is a big one, may not be as straightforward to answer, but we'll give it a go. The brains of children 2 to 3 years old have very high neuroplasticity, so it is very difficult to form memories. I wonder where these previous life memories may reside in the brain. Are there any ideas?
Yeah, that's really an interesting question, and I'm excited that you asked that. We are embarking right now. We in DOPS with a new plan moving forward for all of this court research that includes working with developmental neuroscientists as well as geneticists to do genomic work, because there are multiple ways in which we think the memory abilities, the memory processing, we should be able to work with some neuroimaging evidence in terms of EEG evidence and what's known as FNIRS, near infrared spectroscopy, which is kind of like almost like an fMRI, but a bit of an easier way to approach that than putting a child in a big scanner. And the genetics approach too, we are looking for exactly that. We are looking for markers both at a genetic level, but also neurologically, physiologically. What is different about these children? Where are they? Where are these memories occurring? And how is that? Does it look different than how if we have children? So we're going to think about, like, one way is autobiographical memory is one of the first things we're going to approach is, right. So autobiographical memory is you ask a 3-year-old, tell me about your birthday party last year. Tell me about this event that happened 6 months ago, about you, right? It's autobiographical. And what we're going to look for is see if we ask a child who's not a court child to tell me about your birthday party last year, 6 months ago, and we ask court children, does it look exactly the same? Is it occurring in exactly the same location and in the exact same way? Whether we look at it from an EEG perspective, an FNIRS perspective, we should be able to, we think, potentially see that the children, the court children, we would imagine at this point have differential processing in some way or another. I'm not prepared at this point to make a specific prediction of what that looks like, but our assumption is that these children we know they're significantly more intelligent. That's already been published. They are significantly more verbal. That's been published. High verbal skills, high intelligence, has other researchers have shown that predicts different and better memory processing than children of their age who are lower in those things, intelligence. So I think we're heading down that road, and we're going to start bringing other children in who are control children in a sense, right? Comparison conditions. That's something that we haven't been able to do a lot historically with this. It's been much more of an evidence, sort of just evidence for the phenomenon. We're now moving toward a process. How is this happening? Why is it happening? I hope
Great.
that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to mention that our colleague, Dr. Marietta Pelavanova, is actually on the call as well. Philip may not even know that because he doesn't have the ability to scan the attendees while he's talking. But so I wanted to mention that because between the two of them, we have pretty much two of the people deepest in the cases of the reincarnation type research. So we're lucky to have them both. And Philip, if you want to pull Marietta in, she's already said that she's willing to help answer questions as needed. But I mention it because we can also, for those questions we don't have time to answer, we will get back to you by email. So please, we're not going to be able to take all your questions, but feel free to send questions for Philip, Marietta, or Jim Tucker for that matter, and we'll do our best to get back in touch by email. Another question up for you, Philip. Are there any interesting theories or hypotheses about the connection between reincarnation and dissociative identity disorder?
Given that Marietta and I just today were talking about the follow-up study and the dissociation effects that we have found, although, like I said, not at a level that we would consider pathological. She may be in a better position to speak to anything about dissociation, specifically DID, simply since she's been embedded in that paper, given she's first author on it more than I am. I don't at this point. And the first thing I'll say before Marietta speaks is that it's important to note that the cases that we have in our follow-up study, there are two particular children, now adults, who had pretty high scores. They still weren't like clinical, but they were high. But those children we were able to define in the original database weren't high on dissociation when they were kids. And even now as adults, they're not necessarily, they're two of the people who have no memories at all of their past life. So to me, it feels like I'm not sure that there is a connection there, but Marietta may have a different perspective.
Hi, everyone. I think Dr. Cozzolino gave a great answer, especially about these two cases among the 23 cases. I think our conclusion from this is that it is a connection that could be explored further in another study to see if it is a real connection or it's just something that these two individuals seem to have that Philip said may not at all be related to these memories.
Great, thank you,
So,
Marietta. I'm going to move along because we've gotten a bunch that came in at the end, and so I want to try to get to as many as we can. This seems like a pretty simple one. Do the now grown court kids, meaning now adults, pursue jobs or careers similar to their previous personalities? And I know this is kind of on our minds recently too.
Again, Marietta probably has spent more time digging. We were just talking today. There's one that's a air traffic controller. There's there's someone I think who had a high profile political job. But Marietta, did you find? I mean, it's only 23, but was there any links to the PP?
that's an interesting question. We actually haven't looked for that specifically, and part of the reason is that the occupation of the previous personality is not always available or coded for. And given the already small sample, there was just not a lot of data to work with. But a lot of the jobs that were present in this sample are very kind of modern type jobs that would not have existed in some of these older lives. Not just air traffic controller, but we had a university admin person, for example, an architect, etc. Great question, but we just don't have information on that or sufficient information to look for links.
Okay, and jumping on this, do court kids tend to be of the same gender as their previous personalities?
Marietta, you brought your family tonight, I think. Marietta and Jim published a paper a few years back looking at exactly that question, the issue of gender nonconformity based on cases of previous personality and current child not matching in terms of gender. So Marietta, please talk more about that. It's a fascinating paper.
So first I'll answer the question more directly. So in the large database that we have, I believe up to 90% of the children report a past life of the same sex, which is a very, very, very high percentage. And it tells us that it is not that these past lives are not randomly distributed between male and female, and they seem to correlate with the current sex of the child. So that already is an interesting finding. So the basic finding from the gender nonconformity paper that Philip mentioned is that we found this very interesting correlation that among the few cases that report a life of the opposite sex, there's a much higher rate of what we would call gender nonconforming behavior. And it doesn't have to be pathological, but it could be anywhere from the child saying, I'm a girl when they're a boy, or vice versa, to more mundane stuff like dressing in a way that's more typical of the opposite sex. And among these, what we call sex change cases, the rate of gender nonconformity was 80%, compared to only about 6% in same-sex cases. So that was a very, very significant effect.
Somewhat related to this as well, is that of the 2,254 cases, I think is the number, more than, it's not 50-50, it's the past life memory children are more likely boys than girls.
Which is also very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we are a minute over, and as I was able to message a couple people privately just to say, if we didn't get to your question, please chat us back with your email address and we will do our best to respond to you. We're also going to put an email address in the chat where you can reach out to us with additional questions if you didn't have a chance to ask it on the webinar. dops@uvahealth.org is the place to go. We are, as some of you may know from having contacted us previously, we are flooded with communication from people interested in these topics, people who have had personal experience or loved ones with personal experiences that fit the bill as being extraordinary. So we do our very best to respond to as many emails as we can, and appreciate your understanding. But please keep the questions coming and we'll do our best to respond to you in the coming days and weeks after this webinar. On the topic of limited capacity, we need your support. DOPS is fully funded by individuals, private entities. We don't get state funding, even though we're a part of the University of Virginia. So if you are inspired to help keep this research growing and thriving, as we have these wonderful researchers taking over from some of the folks who have been with us for decades now, please make a gift. Every single donation to DOPS helps us do this work. No gift is too small. So we appreciate your support, even for those of you who can't give philanthropically. We couldn't do it without you. Other ways to get involved in our work: sign up for our e-newsletter, and I think there's a link coming in the chat if it's not there already. We send an e-newsletter about once every 2 months. It's not an exact science, but we don't send a newsletter unless we have news to share. So you won't be inundated with messages from us, and it's a great way to find out about events like this. And I just want to wrap up by thanking Philip so much. Marietta, thanks for jumping in at the last minute here. We did not plan that, but I just thought, hey, you know what? Why not? You know, between the two of them, we should be able to answer any question that you guys have. So I appreciate that, Marietta, and Philip, great job, and loved having all of you with us. Please come back as we continue to host little events like this, and thanks for your support of DOPS. Hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.